This is the FM Gold channel of All India Radio. In the program News Analysis now, we bring you a discussion on need for international peace for coexistence. The participants are A.N. Ram, former diplomat, and Simran Sodhi, foreign editor, The Statesman.
Today is the United Nations International Day for Peace, and we will be discussing the issues related with this. My first question is that the UN has declared this since 1981 through a United Nations General Assembly resolution to be a day of peace. But we find ourselves in a world which is increasingly torn apart by conflict. So how does one manage the contradiction in a real practical world?
The UN was set up in the aftermath of a very violent war. And therefore the priority of the UN ever since it was established in 1945 has been issues concerning peace, coexistence, security. This apart, now of course the agenda of the UN has expanded so much that the definition of peace and coexistence also includes issues of development, issues of health, issues of uplifting the least developed among the developing countries. So I would like to believe that while the aim and the objective of the UN from the beginning has been the same, today the definition, the compass, the scope of the issues of concern to the UN in the sphere of international peace and coexistence have expanded greatly to include not only security concerns, peace issues, conflict situations, but also economic issues, social issues, food security, etc., which give cause for concern to humankind.
The United Nations Secretary General gave a statement today, and he spoke of the need for an inclusive society which is based on mutual respect and on the need to give more education to students. When we talk of an inclusive society, the fact that the world is increasingly being divided in terms of race, caste, gender issues, so how does the UN manage then, in a very practical way, to bring the two together?
You're absolutely right. I think here the idea is a kind of a commitment to the principle of international peace and coexistence, including fundamental issues like education, food, health, human security, etc., as you have very rightly mentioned. The fact that it is inclusive is accepted and known today. Democracy is another aspect of this whole discussion which is now figuring increasingly in UN discourse as well as in discourse in international fora. The point is that it is not whether the UN has succeeded or failed, because the UN has no executive means of ensuring success in many of these areas. Yes, it has certain responsibilities where their success has been commendable. For example, in areas like health, the World Health Organization, Food and Agriculture Organization, the UNDP, the success stories are many to recount. But here the commitment, the fact that the UN principles are based on equality, on inclusive growth, on development through peace and coexistence is what is needed to be highlighted. So long as the international community commits itself to these laudable objectives, then it is the duty of all of us, all the member nations of the UN, to strive together to achieve this goal. And here I must say that individually, perhaps not every country, but individually, many countries have made very remarkable progress. Take India. India's commitment to some of these principles of the UN are perhaps unsurpassed. We have made this known in the international body from 1945 onwards, since we were members. We are one of the largest contributors to the UN peacekeeping mission, to areas like food and agriculture, like health, like UNDP's programs where India is actively involved. So I would like to think that the commitment and the fact that individual nations do accept that commitment and implement them in their own ways is perhaps more important than to judge the UN whether these areas have achieved success or not. Yes, success is important, but that is the responsibility of member states.
Another thing which some people have mentioned, that today being the International Day of Peace, countries should try and cease hostilities at least for this one particular day between themselves. But we have regions in the world, regions like Afghanistan and now the Middle East, especially Syria, where we see a kind of a civil war which is raging for quite a few years now. Appealing for these hostilities to be ceased even for a day in regions like this, is there a rational...
I would go a little beyond. These are all symptoms of the malady. The malady is poverty, malnutrition, disease, hunger, the appetite of countries to dominate one another. These are symptoms. The malady is, I think, the fact that we should have a world where every nation is equal, where all people are equal. You mentioned inclusive growth. Yes, indeed, where growth takes place in a manner where everyone gets a share of the pie. And indeed, the commitment of all of us to solve our disputes, our disagreements through dialogue in a peaceful way. After all, the rationale of the UN was that dialogue is more powerful than the battlefield solutions. So I would like to think that the manifestations of the lack of peace and the lack of coexistence today are increasing. But that is because the world order is not equitable. The world order is still dominated by a group of countries who seek to dominate other countries. There are obviously after effects of economic exploitation, of colonialism, of neocolonialism, of apartheid, of man exploiting man, nations exploiting nations. So I guess the objective here is to set right the underlying forces which can cause nations to live in peace and in harmony. And here you spoke about the role of education. I think education is one of the most important instruments of propagating this principle of international peace and coexistence. So is healthcare, so is development, so is poverty alleviation, so is disaster management, so is environment. So I guess, in a manner of speaking, the whole concept of international peace and coexistence today is extremely enlarged. It is, of course, getting diffused, and the line between the classical definition of peace and today's definition of peace is so blurred that people often try to mistake the symptoms, the symbols of manifestations of the malady to be the disease itself. No, the disease is deeper, and I think we'll have to combat the disease rather than focus on the manifestations of the disease.
There's something you spoke on, and that was apartheid. And a lot of people the world actually has hailed Nelson Mandela as the biggest symbol of non-violence, peace in the world, and also a symbol of how communities and races which have been discriminated against can also find a voice on the global stage. I just wanted your thoughts on the fact that the current US President Barack Obama has a personal legacy of belonging to a black community which did not find political voice for long. Would you say that people like him who have achieved this success are an example on a day like this, that yes, it is possible for communities who were denied a political voice for a very long time are finding non-violent, peaceful ways to find that voice?
To my mind, and perhaps I'm being a little less than broad-minded in this, but to my mind, the ultimate epitome of peace, non-violence, equality, justice in society as well as in countries was Mahatma Gandhi. He was one of the greatest human beings who propagated the ultimate cause of peace and coexistence and development through peaceful means, through non-violence. Very, very true that Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King, and perhaps some of the present-day leaders of the world, including President Obama, are, in a manner of speaking, pursuing the same line of thinking. They are, in fact, they may be called disciples of Mahatma Gandhi in that sense, because each one of them has spoken at one time or another of the fact that how much Gandhi has influenced their lives. So in society, you need people who at least stand up for the virtues of not only honesty, integrity, discipline, commitment, sharing, caring, and above all, peace and coexistence. And every society throws up its own leaders at a particular given time. In today's context, we are fortunate that we have the inspiring presence of Nelson Mandela in South Africa. However, the fact that he is there and once in a while people look up to him for inspiration is a matter of great satisfaction, because societies do need people of that stature, of that kind of commitment, to be able to move forward. Ultimate goal, I believe, of achieving peace is through peaceful means. You can achieve peace through violence, but that is not a peace which can be sustained. There are wars, there are conflict zones today where peace is sought to be restored through violent means. Gandhi would never have advocated that. I'm sure Nelson Mandela would never have advocated that. So the means are as important as the ends, which Gandhiji himself spoke about. So here I think the responsibility of nations, societies is that the means they employ to achieve the ends of peace and coexistence and development and equity are always ethical and peaceful.
If I was to extend the thought that you've just spoken about to the present day situation in Syria and how we are going about handling it, there seems to be a time when it seemed like a military option would be exercised, but now we seem to have gone back to a diplomatic thing. Do you see that as a victory of somehow a definition of peace over violence?
There is no question at all that no final solution can ever be found through violence. Temporary, yes, but permanent solution needs a permanent basis for solution, and that permanent basis for solution is provided only through equity, justice, fair means, and the objective of peace being acceptable to everyone. Now, I would not go into the individual situations, but wherever war has sought to be used as an option, I think it is a retrograde step. Ultimately, we'll have to create a world for ourselves in which all our problems, all our differences, whether political, economic or social or cultural, are resolved through peaceful means. In the spirit of caring, sharing, give and take, we have only one planet, and we don't even know whether there is life outside. Are we going to be so reckless as to annihilate our planet for certain selfish ends which are perhaps purely politically motivated? I think we have got to see the larger picture. The larger picture is the world is a global family, and that global family concept today, on the day of the International Peace and Coexistence, which the UN is observing, should, I think, be the message which should be taught in schools and colleges and to adults alike. And if today's day serves this purpose, then I think it is useful. If it doesn't serve this purpose, there's no need for us to be dejected, because this is not a one-off effort. We'll have to be at it all the time. And so long as there are sane voices in this world, and I would like to believe that India is one of those voices, I think we have reason to hope.
There's also this thought or this theory in international relations currently that democracies do not go to war. And that is the reason why there seems to be a sudden rush or a sudden impetus to promote democracy in the world. Would you support that?
Democracy is very important. Unquestionably, when we speak about peace today and coexistence, one of the underlying pillars is democracy. If you have democracy, then it is assumed that the popular will of the people is prevailing or should prevail. So I think that one of the integral elements of peace and coexistence in this larger concept which I have just now outlined, apart from equity, integrity, commitment, peace and means and ethics, education, health, food for all, development, is also democracy. So if you would like me to briefly say which are the 3 Ds which are important in the context of peace and coexistence today, certainly democracy would top that list. Development would be a very close second, coming along with democracy. Disarmament, which we have not spoken about, but if man kills man through weapons which are becoming increasingly more lethal, then disarmament should also be factored in as one of the Ds. And I think the person who spoke about all this was Mrs. Gandhi, who articulated the importance of development, disarmament, democracy as the basis for our societies to progress together through sharing and through a cooperative approach. So I think one of the things which many of us in India perhaps are increasingly forgetting is that the whole concept of non-alignment, which Panditji propounded at that time, was in fact based on these principles. The Panchashila, non-alignment, the UN of the dreams of Gandhi and of people like that, who were still around at that time. Well, I think these were the principles which contributed to the UN coming into being. And India continues to have a role. And I would like to think that the more we look at the past in an objective way, the better it is for the future.
Thank you.
You were listening to a discussion on need for international peace for coexistence. The participants were A.N. Ram, former diplomat, and Simran Sodhi, foreign editor, The Statesman. It came to you in the program News Analysis, produced and presented by the News Services Division of All India Radio. This program is also available on our website newsonair.nic.in. You may email your opinion about this program at airnsdtalks@gmail.com.